Hey, my name is Ramirez. This is Frogbear.zil. I thought it would be appropriate for me to make this video considering that I am currently detoxing from caffeine and it is driving me insane. But remember, folks, that is a physiological reaction, not a psychological reaction, which is why I also wanted to bring up this article. 5 psychological experiments that explain the modern world. Now, the world is a confusing place. People do things that do not make any sense, think things that aren't supported by facts, endure things they do not need to endure, and will viciously attack those who are trying to bring these things to their attention. If you've ever wondered why, you've come to the right place. If you're a casual reader of the alternative media landscape, you will eventually come up with these references to the Stanley Milgram, or the Philip Zimbardo, or the Asch experiment, or all three. Cognitive dissonance, diffusion of responsibility, and learned helplessness are phrases that regularly do the rounds, but where do they come from and what do they mean? Well, here are the important psychosocial experiments that teach us about the way people think. But more than that, they actually explain how our modern world works and just how we got into this mess. So, the experiment. The Milgram experiment. Can we watch it?
Nazis in World War II. How is it possible, I ask myself, that ordinary people, who are courteous and decent in everyday life, can act callously, inhumanely, without any limitations of conscience? Now, there are some studies in my disciplines under exactly the questions that I wanted to investigate at Yale University.
I guess I could just paraphrase this experiment really quickly.
Develop several theories.
So essentially, they pick a subject. Doctor tells them what they're going to do. Tells them that this is the individual who you're going to be questioning. Right? They're going to ask him a series of questions, supposedly, and that anytime he gets the experiment wrong, or at least he gets an answer wrong, he's going to be met with a certain amount of voltage, right? And the voltage will go up as high as 375, 380. So essentially, they'll start off really low, but the more questions he gets wrong, the higher and higher the voltage has to go. But in this case, right, the scientist is explaining it to him. Essentially, this dude kept going. All of these people kept going. They did not. And the reason why they kept going was because there was a scientist there who always said, don't worry, continue on with the experiment. You will not be held responsible, etc., etc. The experiment. Let's start with the most famous, beginning in 1963. 1963, right? Conceptualizing time is a very important thing with these things. The setting is simple. Subject A to conduct the memory test. Subject B, the administrator of the electric shock. Subject B does not exist, right? It's not real. All that is a voice recording stuff. But the conclusion is, in his paper on this experiment, Stanley coined the term diffusion of responsibility, describing the psychological process by which a person can excuse or justify doing harm to someone if they believe it's not really their fault. They won't be held accountable, or they do not have a choice. The application, absolutely literally endless, right? Because as long as you have an authority figure telling you that it's okay, you will completely agree with the authority figure, absolve yourself of the guilt, and move on with your life. Which is why we looked at that lady at the beginning of the news, of the Matrix news, was because that's what you call diffusion of reality. She feels justified in acting like such a cunt because she believes that she's in the right, and she believes everyone else is in the wrong because an authority figure has told her this is the way to maintain herself in her daily life. Either way, all institutions can use this phenomenon to pressure people into acting against their own moral code. The army, the police, hospital staff, whatever there is a hierarchy or perceived authority, people will fall victim to the diffusion of their own responsibility. Even the Catholic Church is one of these institutions, especially if you're a diehard. Either way. No, they made a decent film about Milgram and the backlashes his experiments caused called Experimenter. In recent years, I'll watch that later. Either way. Number 2, the Stanford Prison Experiment. This one should be very obvious to a lot of people because this is a very famous one. Only slightly less famous than the Milgram's work is Philip Zimbardo's prison experiment carried out by Stanford University in 1971. 1971. The experiment set up a mock prison for a week, with one group of subjects designated as the guards and the others as the prisoners. Both sides were provided uniforms. Prisoners were given a number. The guards were ordered to only ever address prisoners by their number, not their name, a dehumanizing factor. There were a number of other rules and procedures detailed here, whatever. Prisons have rules, apparently. In brief, over the course of the week, guards became increasingly sadistic, dealing out punishments to disobedient prisoners and rewarding good prisoners in order to try and divide them. Many of the prisoners simply took the abuse, and infighting began between troublemakers and good prisoners. Though technically not an experiment, in the purest sense, there was no hypothesis to test and no control group, and perhaps impacted by demand characteristics. The study does reveal interesting patterns of behaviors in the subjects. Conclusion: prison guards became sadistic, prisoners became obedient, all this despite no real laws being broken, no real legal authority, and no real requirement to stay. If you give people power and dehumanize them below them, they will become sadistic. If you put people in prison, they will act like they are in a prison. Which is why I find it very interesting how so this is very specific to the dormitory that I slept in when I went to college. But our dormitory was designed by like the guy who designed the prison that was in that area also designed our dorms. And all of the furniture was made by prisoners too, so it was like really weird. But either way, in short, people will act the way that they are treated. Which is why I always bring up the self-fulfilling prophecy. Because the self-fulfilling prophecy is, you already believe this of yourself. So that means you are already going to act out in the belief that you already have of yourself. Self-fulfilling prophecy. The application, again, endless. We've all seen it throughout the scandemic. If you start treating people a certain way, the majority will go along with it and blame the minority who refuse to cooperate, right? Setting up the division. Meanwhile, police forces around the world were suddenly granted new powers and promptly abused them because the maskless and the uncouth have been dehumanized in their eyes, thanks to mainstream media, right? There are levels to how this control system works. These reactions were engineered, not accidental, because you have to remember, being educated in this sort of material makes you a threat, not in the sense that you will use it, but you know about it. You know the concepts, and because you understand the concepts and you understand what's being played out in front of you, you aren't susceptible to these tactics, which is why I'm a very hard-headed individual, but I love psychology. So I understand aspects of psychology to manipulate myself, and this is something I do to myself. But to see these tactics being implemented these last 7-8 years, all the way up to 2018 is what I'll say. Mainly because these tactics were ramped up through a variety of different means, through actors, media, social media platforms, movies, television, etc., etc. It was trying to build this perceived reality in order to create this, the prison experiment, where it created two specific class of people, the people who played along and the people who didn't, thus causing more internal strife as each year went on. Either way, the next experiment is the Asch experiment. Now, the experiment in conformity, not as brutal as the Milgrams or the Zimbardo, but perhaps more unsettling in its findings. First conducted by Solomon Asch in the 1950s, the setup is a simple one. You put together a panel of subjects, one real subject, and a handful of fake subjects. One by one, the student are asked a series of multiple choice questions to which the answer is always obvious, and all the fake subjects will get every answer wrong. The question is whether or not the real subject will maintain his own correct answer. to begin to conform with the group. Now, this is the one that's most dangerous. In conclusion, which is why I always bring up The Prince, Machiavelli, Italian tactics, politics, internal actors, speaking heads. I always bring up the fact that you can't trust certain people because they have contracts over their head. Like, you know what I mean? Like, let's talk about Joe Rogan, for example. He's tied up in so many contracts that he has to toe a very fine line. So as much as he goes one way, he also has to play into the other side because he is bound by a contract. There's something looming over his head that forces him to act a certain way, which makes him one of the controlled, or at least he makes him a fake subject, because in reality, his answer isn't real. Either way, moving on. One of the subjects is asked all the questions. Oh yeah, the conclusion. Sorry. While most people maintained their right answers, the error rate in the experiment group was 37% versus less than 1% in the control group, meaning that 36% of the subjects eventually began to change their answer to align with the consensus, even though they knew they were wrong. Now, if this was in 1950 and there was only a 36% chance of changing somebody to conform, what were the factors that led to him keeping his own? What led him to stand his ground? What led him to be courageous and still denying the group? If you can attack those factors on a cultural level, what ends up happening to the populace? Well, you get soy boys. Either way, around 1/3 of the people will either pretend to change their minds for the sake of conformity, or, more alarmingly, will actually alter their beliefs if they find themselves in the minority. The application: staged or invented polls, falsified vote counts, bot accounts, astroturfing campaigns, astroturfing, which means completely changing the narrative of a person, completely changing the narrative of a perceived event. Media headlines proclaiming everyone knows X, or only 1% of people think Y, right? Creating perceptions of groups. There are a great many tools you can use in order to create the impression of a fake consensus or a manufactured majority. One of the favorite ones that everybody loves is the toothpaste doctors. 8 out of 10 doctors, 8 out of 10 doctors use Colgate. Note, the experiment has been done a million times in dozens of variations, but perhaps the most interesting finding is that putting just one other person in a panel who agrees with the test subject seemed to reduce conformity by 87%. Essentially, people hate being a lone voice, but will tolerate being in the minority if they have some support. Good to know. Number 4, Festinger's cognitive dissonance experiment. The least well-known experiment on the list, but in some ways the most fascinating. In 1954, when did MK Ultra start? Leon Festinger created an experiment to evaluate the phenomenon of cognitive dissonance. His setup, again, was quite simple. A subject is given a repetitive and dull physical task to do, originally turning wood pegs, but other variations use this task. After the task is complete, the subject is instructed to go and prepare the next subject. Actually, this is a lab assistant for the task, controlled, by lying and telling him or her how interesting the task was. It's at this point the subjects are divided into 2 groups. One group is offered $20 to lie, and the other is only offered $1 to lie. This is a real experiment. The conclusion: this is very interesting actually. After lying to the fake subjects and being paid their money, the real subjects take part in a post-experiment interview and record their genuine thoughts on the task. Interestingly, the $20 generally told the truth, that they found the task dull and repetitive, while the $1 group, more often than not, claimed to have genuinely enjoyed the task. The cognitive dissonance in the action, essentially for the $20 group, the money was a good reason to lie to their fellow test subjects, and they could justify their own behavior in the head. But for the $1 group, the meagerness of the reward made their dishonesty internally unjustifiable, So they had to unconsciously create their own justification by convincing themselves they weren't lying at all, right? Essentially, man, I fucking hate this thing, but I really actually enjoy this thing. It's like, in summary, if you offer people a small reward for doing something, they will pretend to enjoy it or be otherwise invested to justify only making a small profit. Now, let's talk about people who live day-to-day lives, people who live paycheck to paycheck. The applications. Casinos, computer games, and other interactive media uses this principle all the time, offering players very little payoff, knowing they will convince themselves they are enjoying playing the game. Big corporations and employees can likewise rely on this phenomena to keep wages down, knowing that low-paid workers have a psychological mechanism that will convince them that they are enjoying their jobs. This makes me so sad. Note, a variation of this experiment introduces a third group who are paid nothing to lie. The group is not affected by cognitive dissonance and will honestly appraise the task just as the well-paid group do. Very weird experiment. Now, number 5, the monkey ladder. Oh boy. Oof. Now this is somewhat controversial addition to the list, but we'll get to the ladder. It's a very famous experiment you've probably heard cited dozens of times. They call it the monkey ladder. Actually, no, this is not the one I think it is. In the 1960s, scientists at Harvard put 5 monkeys in a cage with a stepladder in the middle. Atop of the stepladder is a bunch of bananas. However, each time a monkey tries to climb the ladder, they are all sprayed with ice-cold water. Eventually, the monkeys learn to avoid the ladder. The one monkey is removed and a new monkey is introduced. He naturally goes straight to the ladder and is set up upon by the other 4 monkeys, right? The new monkey's like, oh, bananas, dude, I'm gonna go get them. The other monkeys are like, oh, hell no. They beat up the monkey to make sure he didn't go after the bananas. Think of it as, actually, no, let's not. I do not want to say that. The one monkey is removed and then a second monkey is removed and a new monkey is introduced. He naturally goes straight for the ladder and is set upon by the other 4 monkeys, including the one who was never sprayed at all. They continue to replace each monkey in turn until no monkey are present, whoever was sprayed with the cold water initially, and yet they all refuse to go near the stairs and prevent all the monkeys from doing so. Right? It's the same experiment where it was like a dentist office, and where everybody else in the dentist office was a fake person, but they all kept standing at a certain time that they heard a beep, and the new person also started repeating that behavior. Eventually, they replace all of the people, and now you have a new set of people that are not in on the joke, but they're still all repeating the same behavior from the previous group. Now, the obvious conclusion here is that people can be conditioned to mindlessly follow the rules they do not understand. What is the situation that we're in now? The only problem with that is that none of this ever happened. Yes, that's the controversy I mentioned earlier. Despite being easily found on every corner of the internet, despite magazine articles explaining it and animations recounting it, it never happened. The experiment appears to be entirely apocryphal? No ladder, no monkeys, no cold water. So while this supposed experiment does actually teach us about herd mentality, it does explain the modern world, because it shows us how easily a myth can be worked into reality through sheer dint or repetition. I'm pretty sure that experiment of people, yeah, I think this is the one. Bonus, monkey ladder redux. That's right, it doesn't stop there, there's a twist. National Geographic did recreate the functional monkey ladder experiment using people. This is the one that I was talking about.
Stop. Pay attention.
Hi, how are you doing?
Right. She walks in. She's the one that does not know what's going on. Everyone else here knows what's going on. One by one, these people start disappearing. Hold on.
Now conforming perfectly to the
Eventually, they all disappear.
Now.
And she still repeats the behavior.
Think she'll teach the new guy what? now become the social norm for
And the whole new group of people actually follows through with it. Like, what? Either way. These were 5 famous experiments that essentially show how they control us. It's not that's it's very complicated. It's not something that just anybody can set up. Of course, you can set up smaller scale experiments this way, but in reality, what I like to focus on is the time period. If some of these experiments, right, the cognitive dissonance experiment, which I consider to be one of the most important, and the Asch experiment, just with those 2 alone, you can already see how moving into the 60s and the 70s could be affected if somebody decided to implement these sort of systems to try to influence large groups and large sets of populaces. I guess that's the way to say it, since I always bring this up with the eugenics movement of the early 1900s. Clearly, there was a very, very conservative effort on part by very certain individuals who shaped our education system, who shaped our infrastructure, who shaped our government, who shaped our industries. They clearly had a vested interest in shaping the world the way they wanted it. And to assume that these people would not read any of this material is kind of laughable to me, but I'll leave it there. My name is Ramirez, and this was another episode of Frog Bear. Hopefully everyone has a great week moving forward, and yeah, that's it. Peace.